Perfect. Well, welcome everybody to the webinar about learning the tools to avoid unwanted forest conversion in the Southeast. We have three great speakers today. And before we get started, I do want to ask that y'all please keep your mics muted so we can give our speakers the total floor so there's no interruptions. And what we will be doing today for questions is type them into the chat box as you have them, and I will read them to our presenters at the end of all three presentations. So we're going to have each presentation, and at the end we have a chunk of time set aside for your questions. And so please type them in to whoever you have the question for, and I'll be sure to read them out loud at the end. And so without further ado, I do want to introduce our first speaker, Scott Davis from Keeping Forests. And Scott worked for the Nature Conservancy for 23 years, serving as a state director, divisional director of conservation programs, and as a senior conservation advisor for the North American region. In 2017, Scott began working with the Endowment for Forests and Communities on the Keeping Forests initiative. Scott's formal training includes the areas of aquatic ecology, sustainable compatible resource use, and sustainable ecosystem management, and has degrees in aquatic ecology from Miami University and Texas A&M. Early in his career, he spent 13 years working in South America and Southeast Asia on a variety of fishery management projects. So without further ado, Scott, I hand it off to you.
Thank you, Dakota. And thanks everyone for joining in today. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about keeping forest. I do. So a systems level approach to forest conservation. I realize that sort of moniker doesn't mean a lot to a lot of people. And hopefully as I kind of go through this presentation, it'll start to make a little bit more sense. But in a nutshell, Keeping Forest is a project that is sponsored by the U.S. Forest Service and the U.S. Endowment for Forest and Communities. And it is focused on primarily on those economic, political, and social drivers that impact private landowners in the ownership and management of their land. It is not a project that's focused on specific pieces of property. You know, this is the beginning of the systems level sort of explanation. It is looking at those kinds of things that influence decision-making by private landowners and is looking for ways to support their long-term ownership and management of property. So this whole effort came about, the impetus behind Keeping Forest was the Southern Futures Forest Project that came out 4 or 5 years ago, maybe a little longer. And it was a Forest Service effort, some of you are probably aware of it, that began to model different scenarios for the 13 states southern forests over the next 30 to 40 years. And they looked at different kinds of climate change regimes, different development regimes, economic kinds of influences. And at the end of the day, those models told them something that kind of disturbed them. So I'm going to run as a way of introducing, there's a lot of ways to think about that data, but I'm going to take it and show it to you in 4 slides, basically a summary. The first 3 slides I'm going to show you are slides that are based on existing data. The 4th slide is predicted, essentially predicted by the Southern Futures Forest Project. So this is housing density in 1940. Housing density in 1970, housing density in 2000, and that's predicted to be what it's going to look like in 2030, right? So this is what got the Forest Service to think we need to develop an approach to thinking about forests at scale. There's 245 million acres of working forest in the South. It's not the kind, it's not the kind of project where you begin picking out 1,000-acre tracts here and there, but you have to think about this project area in its entirety. So this is the problem statement that came out of the Southern Futures Forest Project. It's looking at about a 24 million acre loss of southern forest by 2060. That's what their modeling is predicting. To make this even a little bit more complicated is the fact that the overwhelming majority of the land in this 13 state area is privately owned. It's owned by individuals, families, mostly. And, you know, there's some TMOs and other kinds of large ownerships mixed in there as well. But this isn't public land, right? You can't, you don't have the control in terms of being a government. You don't have the control over what happens to this land. The South, in terms of public ownerships, it looks very different than the West or even the upper Midwest. So this is a slide I like to show because I think it gives you a sense of the problem. And I remember showing this the first time to the Forest Service, and they all just sort of stared at me. But think about that 24 million acres. It represents approximately 10% of the 245 million acres of working forest that are out there now. So you can think of it a couple of ways. Say you want to try to protect that 24 million acres that is predicted to be lost, or that you're willing to sacrifice 90% of this ground and only protect that 24 million acres, you know, over time. And let's just say, for argument's sake, that you do this by purchasing a working forest easement on all this acreage. Well, just for that 10%, that's $240 million a year, every year for the next 100 years. That gets you to 10% of the project area. And I think we all would like to think that we can do better than that. But what this sort of illustrates is that in order to think about the scale of this challenge that we face, we've got to begin thinking about both the problem and the conservation strategies a little different. Conservation strategy at this scale begins to look very different than the conservation strategies I worked on as a state director in Tennessee for the Nature Conservancy, or even as a divisional kind of director. This is not the kind of stuff that historically we've used to protect property. What we're trying to do with keeping forest is essentially shift a paradigm. This project has a 40-year goal. This is a very long-term kind of take on the situation. This is not something that's going to happen in a year or two. It's a long-term sort of perspective. And the intent here is to move away from the traditional approaches to conservation and begin to think about this as a shift in paradigm. So we're not thinking about forests so much as, well, we need to buy and protect this piece, sort of the piecemeal approach, or even that it's sort of an agricultural crop, although a lot of us think of it as that. But rather, the forests in the South are a critical component of our natural infrastructure. These are systems that we require economically, socially, and environmentally in order to survive. Just leave it at that. So the mission here, keeping forest, is to begin to identify the obstacles to the long-term conservation of this land and begin to develop, support, create the enabling conditions that are going to be required in order to maintain this acreage. It's a long-term effort. It's focused on system-level strategies, not site-by-site kinds of things. And most important, and at least as important as almost the conservation itself, is we're trying to figure out what true collaboration around these large-scale conservation issues looks like. How do you do it? It's not so much just, we're going to partner in this and that. It's a different kind of animal. to bring together the partnerships that are necessary in order to make this work. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. It's often referred to as a collective impact model. You might see that in different scenarios, working with different kinds of problems. We'll talk a little bit about that as well. All right, these are the underlying assumptions to the Keeping Forest project. The one in white is really the one that I think we all probably intuitively feel the most, right? But this project is focused on working forests. We're not really concerned about what some people would consider high value conservation forest, or places that you're really trying to protect for a rare and endangered species or something like that. There's an acknowledgement that most of these forests are privately owned. But the underlying assumption that really matters here, I think, that really is important, is this idea that if people can't make a living, or at least pay the taxes on a working forest, they're going to convert it to another land use that does pay. I mean, land tends to move toward its quote highest and best use, and that is usually an economically derived value. Highest and best use of property is rarely sort of a spiritual kind of thing. It has a dollar sign. So if landowners can't, and you all know this, if landowners can't at least pay the taxes, if they can't make a living managing and owning their forests, they're likely to convert it to something else. So for all of you that write a lot of proposals, you know, the theory of change is kind of the thing that people ask about these days. What's your theory of change? How are you going to do this? Essentially, what's the underlying concept here? And this is this whole idea of collective impact, right? And there's a lot of definitions. Here's one of them. And it's the commitment of a group of actors from different sectors to a common agenda, right? So it is about bringing people together that have very different perspectives, maybe in the beginning, very different goals. They may even, you know, not be positively associated with each other, but bringing them together to create sort of a common alignment, a common vision, and then a common suite of strategies that collectively they implement. So, you know, this is just a little illustration of that. All of you that have worked for nonprofits know that you wind up competing with similar nonprofits for funding sources. It's not a particularly effective way to do conservation, but that's what happens. Occasionally we'll coordinate. Sometimes we'll leverage, you know, and you know, that's about, you know, using some funds over here as match to raise additional funds over there. If we're smart and we're thoughtful and the problem's big enough, we begin to sort of integrate some of our strategies. And by integrate, I mean, we're actually creating a whole that is in fact greater than the sum of its parts, right? And when you do that in a particularly effective way over time, you get to this transformation. And that's what collaborative impact is about. And that is the intent. That's what we're trying to do here with Keeping Forest. Now, Keeping Forest has only been around for a couple of years. I think we got 37 more years to go before, you know, we hit our defined goal. So we'll see. This is a challenging approach. These are just some of the partners, right? Everything from universities to conservation organizations, World Wildlife Fund's thrown in here. And those of you that know, World Wildlife Fund and SFI, those are two different certification programs. They don't often get along in the same room. They're all working together on this project. Georgia Pacific, all the state and federal agencies, you know, Forest Landowners Association, a couple of TMOs, et cetera. All with very different perspectives, but all have agreed essentially that we need to find a way for their own good to sustain this 245 million acres of southern forest. Okay. Some of you may have heard the term systems mapping, and this is the approach that we used to sort of get to strategy. And there's a couple of reasons that you do this. One is it aligns everybody around a common definition of the problem. I know that almost everybody on this call sat around a table for a meeting, and the intent of the meeting was to get to some sort of agreed upon strategy. But everybody at the table didn't have the same definition of the problem. And it makes it really hard then to develop strategies that everybody is willing to engage in, invest in, and work on. So the intent here is to develop a common understanding, a common vision of the problem. And from there to begin to develop a suite of strategies to attack that problem. And at the same time, create this functional coalition of partners that can work on it. And you know, the other thing that I know that many of you have experienced is sitting around a table with people that you might even consider adversaries. And someone says, it's sunny out today. And everyone kind of nods their head, but you're thinking, no, it's raining. You're wrong, but I'm sitting here nodding my head. This process essentially is a way of creating a little bit of understanding, trust, and respect among the partners. We probably, in this system mapping process, I should know, but I can't remember, had maybe 7 meetings, multiple days, 7 3-day meetings in a year. So these people were all thrown together in an airport hotel in Atlanta 7 times for 3 days at a time. And by the time they left, they knew each other, they understood each other, they respected each other, and they liked each other as people. So this, I'm not expecting you to look at this and understand it, but this is the system map that was created by this group of people. And this was facilitated by people that are a heck of a lot smarter than I am. It helped us put this together. But each one of these nodes that you see in here, where arrows meet other arrows, are places where you could choose to work if you wanted. There are 2.5 full-time staff associated with keeping forests. So we've chosen just 3 of, I don't know, maybe 100 of them in there. But there's a process that you go through to create this situational diagram. There's a process you go through, and it's a very inclusive process. It's both quantitative and qualitative, right? So values are assigned to certain things, and they're put into the algorithm, and then some of it comes down to people's opinions. But at the end of the day, you rank some of these nodes, you rank some of these intersections, and then you choose from that suite. In the middle of this thing, that little tiny typing that you can't see, it gives you what is written on top of this slide, which is essentially the goal of the system mapping effort. By 2060, we'll have created the enabling conditions needed to maintain 245 million acres of southern forest. So that's how this project kind of came to be. Here's the 3 things that this group of people decided were really important strategic levers to work on. Now, we call these strategic levers, and underneath, and I'm going to get to this in a second, but underneath each of these levers are sort of highfalutin stated strategies, and then a whole suite of actual activities that people are doing. Healthy forest, or healthy markets make healthy forests. We've all sort of heard, understand that, makes intuitive sense. It was really interesting for me. I'll be perfectly honest with everybody on this call. As somebody that has worked in more of a traditionally focused conservation side of this, to think about it this way, right? but it makes sense, and I understand it, and actually have grown to appreciate the importance that healthy markets have in the long-term maintenance of healthy forests. So there's a traditional forest products team here that's focused on that promoting forest products lever. The creating emerging markets is about ecosystem services, right? It's about all the services that functional forests provide that we really don't pay for. It's the carbon sequestration, it's water, it's flood mitigation, it's biodiversity habitat. It's all those other kinds of things that private landowners are essentially providing to the public at large at no cost. And it seemed to this group that if we could figure out how to develop bona fide markets around some of those services that landowners could take advantage of, that would be helpful. The last one, excuse me, generating critical mass is really, it's also, you'll see it in here as labeled as champions and leaders. And at its core, it's essentially a communication strategy, right? We're trying to shift a paradigm, and you don't do that without some fairly thoughtful communication strategies. The champions and leaders moniker acknowledges that certain people need to be the ones that are communicating these messages, and that the idea there is to really understand what people are reacting to, develop suites of messages around that, then identify and cultivate champions and leaders in the social, political, and economic realms that can carry those messages over time. This is a long-term project, I've said it before. All right, so what does that look like on the ground, right? We have created 3 teams, one for each of these, that are made up of subsets of the partners that I showed on the previous couple slides back. They're the ones that drive this, really. As the director of this thing, I am a facilitator more than a leader. I simply facilitate their ability to come together, define strategy, and drive it forward. So promoting the traditional forest products team developed these 3 strategies: high leverage opportunities to increase forest market for southern timber resources, increase demand, and promote retention, recruitment, expansion of industry facilities. What this translates out to in real life is we have supported a fair amount of research, really trying to understand the market dynamics in the South. And we've all seen the distortions recently, right? A wall of wood, but lumber prices through the roof, timber prices to the landowner, nobody's getting anything for it. So we're really, we've invested a little bit of money in really trying to understand what's going on in terms of market dynamics and how it might impact the manufacturing. And in this case, I should say, our traditional forest products focus has been mass timber. I mean, there's a lot of products out there. We could talk about toilet paper, we could talk about plywood, we could talk about a lot of different things, but in order to stay focused and essentially try some of this, we have landed on mass timber and trying to.
This is your 5-minute warning.
Oh, okay. I need to get going. My clock went off. Education and outreach. We're looking at developing partnerships with the Department of Architecture and various universities, and working on looking at some new state building codes. The emerging markets, I'm going to skip right by that. We spent a lot of time trying to understand what landowners want and need in order to participate in some of these payment for ecosystem programs. You can have the money, but if the landowners won't engage because they don't want to sign a permanent easement on their property or get nailed down too tightly, you're dead in the water. What do we need to do? we're trying to really understand what the impacts of various forest practices are on water, quality and quantity downstream, so that we can put a number to those practices. We're trying to help people understand where you find the funding to put together payment for ecosystem service projects. This group is focused primarily on the forest water connection. They didn't feel like there was a lot they could add on the carbon side. Then champions and leaders, we've spent a lot of time trying to figure out how people are reacting to different visuals and different words. We've done both qualitative and quantitative research. As you all know, sometimes someone will see a load of logs in a truck, and what they're seeing is a load of dead bodies. They need to understand how the system works, and we need to find a way to communicate to them. So we're working on message development. We actually have a communications playbook that is just about to come out that we're going to use to test through NGO and academic leadership and see if their constituents respond to it in a way that sort of makes sense. And in the process, we're identifying and trying to cultivate some of the new champions and leaders that are willing to carry these messages over time. So at the end of this, as I said, this is a 40-year project. I think we'll be successful if we have a functional collaborative that can hang together for 40 years. I think we'll be successful if we have local and engaged leadership that are willing to kind of carry this forward. We're gonna have to have that collective impact model. We're gonna have to figure out how to make that work. And those are public-private partnerships. And that's the only way I can think of to solve problems at this scale. The policy and related enabling conditions piece is critical. You can leverage a lot of things with policy. And we're beginning to look a lot harder at some of those sorts of things. And I think we'll be successful if healthy markets are out there for all kinds of forest-related products, and that people do understand that southern forests are essentially critical infrastructure. How's that? All done. So thank you for taking the time to listen to this. I know none of this solves anybody's problem today, but I'm hopeful that in the next 10 to 20 years, we're going to get to a place in this country where we collectively fully understand and appreciate the value of functioning forest ecosystems, both traditionally conserved and working forests. Thank you very much. Appreciate the time today.
Great. Thank you, Scott. And just as a reminder, we'll ask all the questions at the very end. And so now I do want to introduce our next speaker, Joshua Walden from the Center for Heirs' property. And so, Josh, if you want to start sharing your screen, I think you might be able to just steal it from Scott, but Scott, you might want to
yeah, let's see.
Stop sharing your screen.
Stole it, so I think we're good. I think I may have stolen it.
Okay, perfect.
There
Perfect. Yep, I see it right there. And
Okay.
Josh, yep, he joined the Center for Heirs' Property Preservation in 2009 as supervising attorney and is currently the Chief Operating Officer. And he has been practicing law for over 20 years, primarily in the areas of real estate and estates, and is also a South Carolina certified civil court mediator. So Josh, I will hand it off to you.
All right, well, thank you. And as Scott stated, it's a pleasure to be presenting to all of you today. What I hope to accomplish, anytime you're talking about heirs property and the legalities associated with heirs property, the laws invariably differ from state to state, but the concepts we're going to look into will translate across borders. And hopefully when we're finished, we've got an idea, a little better understanding of what heirs property is legally speaking and what makes it uniquely vulnerable to unwanted conversion. And sometimes, depending on what someone may or may not know about their rights, or may or may not know about the possibility of what possibilities are held with the land, unwanted conversion or a wanted conversion could have become an unwanted conversion had they known about sustainable forestry or utilizing the land to generate generational wealth. I thought that one of the things I want to provide at the beginning is at least a little bit of context about what the Center for Heirs Property does, because it sort of lends itself to, I suppose, why I was invited to this webinar based on unwanted conversion and how that relates to conservation or the protecting of forests. The center was established in 2005. I joined in 2009. It was primarily at the beginning an organization that provided education and direct legal services to resolve heirs property and estate issues. In 2013, we started our forestry program by way of a grant through the U.S. Endowment for Forestry and Communities. That's been an extremely successful program, but obviously that brought us into the realm of sustainable forestry, as well as the options available to certain folks through South Carolina Nrcs and the Eqip cost share programs and that sort of thing as far as forestry. I suppose that when we're talking about the takeaways from this in regards to the heirs property issue, first and foremost, what is heirs property? Again, the laws can differ from state to state, but generally speaking, no matter what state you're in, there's a system for recording ownership of land and the transfer of ownership of land. And at its most basic level, land goes from one person to another a couple of different ways. One, someone can sell someone land, and a deed is signed, and generally that deed is recorded in the Register of Deeds office in the county where the property is located. Or someone can give land away, and the same deed, that deed can be recorded in the Register of Deeds office. Or someone can die owning land, and when they die owning land, most states generally have a process whereby a record is created in regards to who's taking that land upon the passing of the original owner. Generally speaking, you're looking at a testate versus an intestate estate. Testate estate is if someone has a will. Obviously, the will hopefully provide guidance to the court to establish who the property is going to. If they pass without a will, most states have what's called an intestacy law. That intestacy law basically describes who the heirs are in accord with whatever state code provides who inherits when a will doesn't exist. And it can get a little convoluted, and it can get a little complex, because most states law has evolved over time. And when you're looking at the history of a particular piece of property and you're sort of applying the law across time, that law can change. So who inherits when someone doesn't have a will in 1923 can be different than if it happens in 1985, and it can be different if it happens in 2010, depending on the change or evolution of the law over time. So those sort of things can happen across one family tree over generations. So when we're talking about that record being created, the deeds in the Register of Deeds office, or the estate, the probate of estate or estate administration when someone passes away, the records in the deed office, the records in the probate court office, or whatever court in your state handles estates, will create the record of ownership, or a chain of title. And for our purposes, that chain of title, best way to think about it is a chain from owner to owner, or based on transfer to transfer. And over the course of time, you should be able to track the ownership of a particular piece of property across time. The problem with heirs property, or what constitutes something being heirs property, is in essence that chain is broken. There's a missing piece of information. An example would be if someone passed away in 1950 and they owned 200 acres, and maybe they had 10 children. If they didn't have a will, generally in South Carolina, you have 10 years to administer that estate or create that record per the probate court records as to who inherited from that individual. If that estate is never administered, whether they had a will or whether they didn't, there is a gap in the ownership record. So if somebody were to take a look at the chain of title, they see that the individual who died in 1950, who maybe acquired the property in 1930, they could find the deed into his name in 1930, but they would never find anything regarding him having transferred the property by deed during his lifetime, because in our scenario he didn't, or they would never find the estate record to show that he died in 1950 and had X number of children who would have inherited. So what typically happens then is over the course of time, that generational lack of record continues. So he passes away and that estate is never administered. So oftentimes, and you may have encountered this depending on if you've come across heirs property either in your own family or dealing with your respective work, that the county tax records basically refer to that piece of property as the estate of John Smith or whoever that last record owner having passed away, or heirs of John Smith. So at that point, there is no record. The interesting thing is that the interest that pass by way of law within a state, in a scenario where someone dies without a will, continue to transfer interest by what's called operation of law. In other words, our gentleman who died in 1950, the instant he passed away, there was no will. Then according to South Carolina, his wife would have inherited 1/3 and his children would have inherited the other 2/3 of any property that he owned. That happens by operation of law based on the facts at the time of death. The problem is there's not a record in the probate court that is part of the public record that anyone could go and see that when he died, he had a wife, X number of children, and the allocation of fractional interest are set forth there. So again, there is no record of ownership. Another issue with that and how owning heirs property affects you or affects anyone or a family in that case, and if you're talking about a family, whether a family farm or a family tract of land that they're utilizing for sustainable forestry, or maybe interested in a conservation easement of some kind, absent that record, the property has what's called a cloud on the chain of title. And ultimately, the ownership interest and the ownership rights based on that kind of transfer and that kind of resulting ownership is what lends itself to a lot of problems with heirs property. It lends itself to the possibility of unwanted conversion through a couple of avenues that we're going to explore in a little bit. What I tell most folks when they're thinking about that form of ownership, whether they're a family that's dealing with it or folks who maybe aren't that familiar with it, the best way to think about it is if you had 10 acres and 10 heirs. Our gentleman who died in 1950 had 10 heirs and 10 acres, and obviously the logical assumption would be each heir owns 1 acre, which is not the case. That ownership is what's called a tenancy in common, and each owner has the undivided right and interest to the whole property, not just 1 acre. So one of those individual heirs or tenants in common has right to use of the whole 10 acres, even though they own 1/10 interest in 10 acres. Now that group can get together and decide they want to divide that property, if that's what they want to do, and bring an action to establish the record of who the owners are and to establish an agreement amongst everyone that they want to divide it in a certain way in regards to each heir getting a 1 acre tract. Now, that comes off my tongue more readily than it happens in real life as far as negotiating with a family, and we'll get to some of the issues involved with multiple generational heirs property and what makes that particularly uniquely vulnerable to unwanted conversion. Those heirs each have that right. They have the 1/10 interest in each one of those. Each one of those heirs has that 1/10 interest in the totality of 10 acres. Now, if we're getting to how does that affect your average family? Well, again, we talked about the no clear title to the property basically places the property in almost a limbo, because anything that's going to require proof of ownership, whether that be a mortgage, whether that be for purposes of leveraging or using the property for collateral for purposes of anything, home improvement, farm improvement, whether it's using the property for purposes of collateral for a tractor or a portion of it for a tractor or for other equipment, whether it's receiving services by way of FEMA after a natural disaster. Anything that requires proof of ownership is simply out of the realm of possibility when the property is held as heirs property, because there is no record of ownership. And what that can ultimately lead to is that the property becomes a liability rather than an asset. That at the end of the day, folks can't take advantage of the property to the fullest extent because of that problem associated with the cloud on the chain of title. Another thing that can come into play for purposes of the idea that the property could be lost is it goes back and is based on that form of ownership, that tenancy and common form of ownership, and what the rights are for each heir. I guess the best way to think about that is in that scenario where we have the 10 heirs and the 10 acres. A couple of different things. One, if one of those heirs is of the mind to want a sale of the property, that heir can sue the other heirs for what's called a partition sale. And that's where he just brings an action against the court for purposes of saying 10 of us own this 10 acres. We can't come to an agreement to divide the property physically by way of a physical partition. So I want the court to sell the property, and at the end of the day, the money will be split in accord with our individual fractional interests. That's one way that unwanted conversion can happen. Another way, and that is something that's relatively common, particularly the longer the property goes in this state of ownership. And by that I mean the longer that generational intestate inheritance happens, that people pass without wills, the estates are not probated in the probate court for purpose of creating the record, and that group of tenants gets bigger and bigger and bigger, right? And that can lead to a large group of folks that can include some folks that many people would never anticipate it would include based on the laws of a given state. Another possibility for a forced sale can come by way of a non-family member. And this is something that I know is recently gotten some headway in the press, and that's forced partition sales, or that predatory development aspect of forced sales. If I'm a developer and I find an heir who has, and I buy that heir's interest, if I buy one of those 10 acres, one of those 10 heirs who own that 10 acres collectively, then I step into the shoes of that particular owner. So then now you have the 9 heirs of the original owner, and then this company or this developer who bought the interest of one of the heirs, and that is a new member of the family. And at that point, they have the same rights as all the other heirs, which includes that ability to force a partition sale. And very often that's how forced conversion with heirs property happened, particularly in areas that were highly sought after, areas that now have a high value where maybe at one time they didn't. Hilton Head, certain parts of Hilton Head look like Hilton Head for a reason, and sometimes history has shown that a lot of folks that owned, or families that owned property in that area, were taken advantage of very often by predatory developers in that aspect. And so that's one of the primary ways folks can lose property. Another way is by way of tax sales, and that can simply just happen based on, if the original owner was 1950, and at this point you have maybe 70 tenants in common and they're all family, maybe 1 or 2 people are paying the taxes on the property, or maybe one person. I see that very often, and that person either can no longer pay the taxes, or the taxes become burdensome when weighed against the fractional interest they may own and the lack of contribution from other family members. I've seen instances where heirs property was sold at tax sale simply because either someone couldn't pay, decided not to pay, and didn't tell anyone else, or in some cases by way of gentrification, which can also occur in rural areas by way of incoming businesses that drive up the tax valuations, the taxes can sometimes become too burdensome for folks to pay, even if they want to keep it, because very often the folks that, at least the folks that we deal with in the heirs property cases, are below wealth, and the idea of taxes jumping $1,000 a year is it proves extremely problematic. One of the issues that is also part and parcel to the heirs property problem, and I'll click on this. If you see this, this is a relatively simple idea of a basic heirs property. And you can see there that if the owner died in 2000 and you had a pre-deceased child in 90, that, you know, a grand or a great grand could inherit. The two children who are alive, child B and C there, are still alive, so obviously they inherit. The children under child C don't inherit because grandchild under child C don't inherit because child C is still living. And then you can see that a stepchild by way of marriage into the family when child E passed away. And so a spouse inherited because he or she passed after child E, they inherited an interest in that property, and then a stepchild inherited when the spouse passed away. So you can see it can make for some strange bedfellows. And if you carry this out to 3 and 4 generations, and you carry this out to everyone on this slide is dead, and they may have, you know, you're going to have folks who are varying degrees of familial relationship to the original owner, which can prove problematic when you're trying to get everyone on the same page. And then you also have people who in no way are in any way blood related to the original owner who passed in 2000. They are what we call laughing heirs. They simply inherited by way of intestacy law and acquired an interest in the property. So the longer the problem goes without the family looking to resolve it, the more difficult it becomes, because that tenancy and common ownership group continues to grow over time. And it's not something that generally stops. It generally becomes more complex. And one of the things that you're looking at in regards to the family is sort of that family dynamic. When we're looking at clearing that title, or sort of avenues to address the issue, first and foremost, there has to be a legal process to clear the title, a quiet title action, generally speaking, in South Carolina. But there is an avenue action in every state whereby property that does not have clean title or a complete recorded history of title ownership, a mechanism to bring that into effect via a court order by way of presenting evidence and testimony and that sort of thing. And obviously, as you might imagine, the longer that time frame is, the more complex and challenging the issue is to present to a court. One of the reestablishing and maintaining that title, generally, if the family wants to protect the land, you want to go into a court with full agreement. Some of the family dynamic, and this is where the mediation component of the center's work comes into play, is what you find amongst family members when it's multiple generations. There are all kind of dynamics to overcome. We've never had a case that resolved that everyone came in and it was kumbaya and everybody's holding hands. Things like heirs who pay taxes and heirs who don't, that dynamic. Heirs who live on the land and heirs who don't live on the land. Heirs whose immediate family stayed in the state and on the land versus heirs, family members who moved away and at a certain point didn't even know they had an interest in the land. That's an interesting dynamic that has to be resolved. Heirs who consider the only blood heirs people who should be involved regardless of what the law says. That can be a difficult conversation. Heirs who want to sell versus heirs who want to keep. Heirs who want to develop versus heirs who want to leave the land exactly as it is. So a whole bevy of issues that come up in an heirs property. And as an attorney trying to resolve an heirs property issue, the best ways to protect against that sort of conversion, the unwanted conversion, is one, there's going to have to be a trusted legal resource for the family, because very often, at least in our cases, we're dealing with historically underserved landowners who don't necessarily trust the legal system, nor should they, given the history in the area. So being able to have access to a trusted legal resource, getting the family on the same page for purposes of what they want to do. Now, if all that can be accomplished, if you want to avoid heirs property, you simply have a will. You have a succession or estate plan in place. If it's land that's primarily being used for business purposes, there's a lot of different avenues of the original owner. Before passing away, they may have a will that establishes who they want the land to go to. They may set up a trust, a living trust, or a pour over provision in their will that puts it into a trust. A lot of different avenues there. They may have established or can establish an LLC for purpose of operating the business. Those things can remove the possibility of an heirs property problem arising, and therefore all these things that I've been talking about as far as potential roadblocks or pitfalls when someone has property. And in the end, the idea of establishing a plan for the property while someone's still alive. Once it's heirs property, there's no way around having to retain an attorney for purposes of resolving or clearing the title. Hopefully they can access a trusted resource as well as the mediation component and someone that can provide sort of the panorama of the possibilities of the land. It doesn't always have to end in sale, but obviously an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And if someone owns a large tract of land and they're utilizing it for forestry or something like that, then having some sort of a succession plan or estate plan in place, placing the property in a trust or placing the property or forming an LLC and placing it in the LLC or other corp, depending on what their goal is or what their current business is a great way to deter that issue.
Josh, you have about 5 minutes left.
Thank you. I looked at my clock and I saw that I was down there. So I'm glad you said that anyway. The idea of getting folks to understand what the possibilities of land, that's part of what we do. The idea that very often folks will have hundreds of acres and to them it's just woods or it's just property that presents an issue. They work for the property in no way works for them. The idea that this is just something that's a drain on me for purposes of taxes. Nobody's utilizing the land, maybe was cut 20, 25 years ago. There's been no sustainable forestry activity. There's been nothing done on the property. A lot of folks, once they realize the property can be utilized, it can be the carrot on the stick for the purpose of putting in place an estate plan or succession plan or forming an LLC or setting up a trust. Once that property becomes a resource rather than a liability, very often it can change that sort of the dynamic and the way certain folks look at the land. So, and that's really it for me. I know we're gonna have questions at the end, so I'll be glad to answer any that might come about that aren't necessarily state specific. But thank you for having me and appreciate your time.
Great, thanks, Josh. And yes, we will be doing questions at the end. So our next presentation is looking ahead, avoiding conversion through incentives programs and certification, presented by Julius George with the USDA Nrcs. And so Julius, whenever you're ready to start sharing your screen, we're ready for you. And he is the Assistant State Conservationist for Programs for North Carolina, located in Raleigh at the NRCS State Office. Julius has been a part of the NRCS family for more than 19 years, serving in the following positions: Soil Conservationist, District Conservationist, Area Resource Conservationist, Farm Bill Specialist, Assistant State Conservationist for Field Operations, and in his current role as the Assistant State Conservationist for Programs. Throughout his career, Julius has had the opportunity to work in the state of Georgia and moved to North Carolina in 2013. He earned an environmental soil science degree from Fort Valley State University, located in Fort Valley, Georgia. He's extremely excited to serve the employees, partners, and producers of the great state of North Carolina, and we're very happy to have you today. So without further ado, Julius George.
Thank you so much, Dakota. Good afternoon, everyone. Hope everyone is well. It's kind of difficult coming in behind such great presentations from both Joshua as well as Scott. So I hope I'm able to keep the good news flowing to actually provide good information to everyone that's actually participating. As Dakota identified, my name is Julius George. Are my slides moving? Okay, there we go. My name is Julius George. I'm actually the Assistant State Conservation for Programs here in North Carolina for USDA Nrcs. Today, I will be touching base with you all about the significance and to continue the information and insight on how private forestry landowners can take advantage of the various different programs that we have available, both financially and technical, to assist them in preserving their land and addressing natural resource concerns. As part of NRCS, our main purpose is to work with landowners to protect state and natural resources by providing both technical and cost share assistance to address natural resource issues. In doing so, one of my main priorities as part of the agency is actually to provide our technical assistance. When we say technical assistance, we like to inform and let everyone know that that is the foundation of what our agency was built from, and also what we continue to strive to provide to this day. Most landowners that actually express interest in NRCS and programs nowadays seek financial assistance, but we never want to lose sight of what our foundation is, which is providing great technical assistance on preserving our great natural resources that we have on our land. Now, how can we do that? We actually work towards preserving and providing great technical assistance by offering what we call conservation planning. Each of our field staff, whether it be the district conservationist or our soil conservation who is aspiring to become a district conservationist and elevating even higher in their career, we all actually work towards obtaining what we call a certified conservation planning certificate. Basically, what that does is allows us to provide the best customer service possible to any landowner, whether it be in the forestry arena or any other agricultural, to actually provide recommendations and practices that will address resource concerns that they have on their property. From a forested aspect, those resource concerns could range from soil erosion to degraded plant conditions to various different arenas and so forth and so on. Well, as part of conservation planning, what our field staff actually does is visit with the landowners to discuss what their ultimate objective is for their land, working with them to determine what direction they're trying to actually take their property. They're looking to elevate it to additional conservation measures, whether it be they're trying to strive toward timber management, wildlife, or anything of that nature, but basing your conservation plan around your ultimate objectives. In doing so, they typically set up a meeting with their participants, visit with them to identify what resource concerns are actually currently on the property based on the current land use, if it's forestry or if it's general ag land, and then also make recommendations to address those resource concerns. And in doing so, as part of a technical conservation plan, our field staff will provide that landowner with a detailed document that actually provides both aerial as well as soil maps as well as topographic. Along with that comes with the recommendations for conservation practices that will address each of those resource concerns that are identified on their property. And part of conservation planning is looking at the least cost alternative to addressing those issues. So as part of that conservation plan and that document that's provided to landowners, that document will entail those practices that are least cost alternative that can assist them in addressing those issues that they currently have on the ground. As they discuss the conservation plan itself and also how to address those resource concerns, our field staff also takes the initiative to identify various conservation programs that we have available that can assist them in accomplishing and implementing those practices and addressing those resource concerns. In doing so, we have two of our most popular programs, which you may see on the screen, which is Eqip, which is their Environmental Quality Incentive Program. And then we also have the Conservation Stewardship Program, which is also known as CSP. Just so everyone knows, we use acronyms for everything, so please forgive me. I use an acronym, and then during the question, if you'd like for me to elaborate, please let me know. Well, Eqip is our most popular program. Currently, we do about somewhere ranging between $20 to $24 million that we provide in contracts to landowners here in the state of North Carolina to address resource concerns on all land uses, and especially on forestry, as well as with participants as part of wildlife. With Eqip, we like to focus on mainly addressing those resource concerns such as your soil, water, air quality, energy, and other related natural resources as well. Eqip is often looked at as a fix-it program, meaning through Eqip, it allows us to take action and focus specifically on the resource concerns that are currently on the ground, determine how we can address that, and also providing those dollars in which we can utilize to address that through this particular program. The other program that's most popular in the state that is constantly growing is our Conservation Stewardship Program. Within CSP, the Conservation Stewardship Program, it actually allows us to enhance what you currently have on the ground, other additional conservation measures that were in place prior to you expressing interest, and taking those conservation measures to another level of management, improving the level of management when it comes to the quality of your land and also improving what you currently have on the ground. So CSP is another one of our most popular programs that is constantly picking up wave and actually starting to increase in numbers as well as cost. As we get to talking about CSP, I'll throw something out to everyone that will kind of spark your interest as to why this is on the rise. As I mentioned, Eqip, well, under Eqip, there are various other different programs or sub-programs that actually are often made available to assist. Under the new Farm Bill, there are several new programs that have been released that we're now starting to implement. Some was recently rolled out at the latter part of this year. As a matter of fact, Climate Smart Agriculture and Forestry was just recently rolled out as of 1 month ago in the first part of July. And with that being said, it was one of our most newly utilized programs. Now another program on the rise is our conservation incentive contracts. Conservation incentive contracts allows the participants to not only be able to take advantage of Eqip, but also be able to take advantage of CSP as well. It allows them to merge both programs into one, pick a portion of their land in which they were looking and interested in offering to determine if their interest is to go towards CSP or to actually maintain and stick with Eqip. And then you also have the urban agriculture. Urban agriculture is part of the new Farm Bill where there's an emphasis on providing assistance in urban areas, whether it be to address forestry related or other agricultural things. So I wanted to make sure you all were aware of the additional programs that are coming our way in FY22 that could be beneficial to all of our forested landowners. Now, the other program is CSP, which is our stewardship program. This particular program has both the general as well as the renewal. Within this program actually requires you to enter into a 5-year contract. And as part of that, you also have an opportunity to renew that contract for an additional 5 years once your original 5 years are up. So that's another reason why the Conservation Stewardship Program is currently on the rise. I would like to let everyone know that because of these new programs, we will be releasing additional information for FY22, which is fiscal year 22, which starts on October the 1st. And as part of that, we will actually be providing additional information and placing it on our website to clearly define more about these programs. Or if you're interested in learning more, feel free to reach out to any of our local field offices or feel free to contact myself. With any of our programs, there are eligibility requirements. There are requirements that must be met in order to participate and also be considered for funding as part of our program. Part of that eligibility requirements entails applicant eligibility, land eligibility, as well as stewardship threshold eligibility, which only applies to our CSP and CSP renewal program. Now, when we're talking about program eligibility, there's several things that we must take in consideration. In order to be considered for NRCS programs, you must be an agriculture producer engaged in agriculture production or have an interest in the operation itself. You must establish records with the Farm Service Agency. Therefore, there are a sister agency which actually maintains our records for all of our producers throughout the North Carolina as well as throughout the nation. You must have control of the actual property in which you're interested in enrolling our programs for the full term of the contract. Be in compliance with our highly erodible and wetland conservation compliance. So we must make sure that you actually, if you do have highly erodible land, that we are following a conservation plan to address those highly erodible acres and or wetland conservation as well. The most important part is you must be make less than $900,000 for both your income on farm as well as outside of the farm in order to qualify. Many say, well, there's no one that makes $900,000. Be surprised. There are a lot of producers out there that actually are profiting and make more than $900,000 that do not get an opportunity to take advantage of our programs for that reason. You know, these programs are designed to provide assistance to help individuals that really do have major needs and also have issues of funding that can assist them in addressing those needs. We must also be agricultural land, non-industrial private forest land, or cropland or something of that nature. Another quick portion and very important as part of our eligibility is if you are a forested producer, you must actually obtain a forest management plan. That forest management plan is very similar to our conservation plan, where it provides a prescription of the various different practices that can be implemented on your property to improve your management and things of that nature. So that forest management plan is critical for any of our programs for all of our forested landowners. Now, when we're talking about applicant eligibility, it somewhat goes back over some of those things I just recently mentioned, but I wanted to make sure I also pointed out just a few other important details, as this does apply to many of our producers, especially with forested land. You must be the owner, operator, or other tenant as listed in the farm service records. And within the farm service records, you have to actually identify whether you are a operator or a tenant. That information is listed. When you go into FSA, you will be assigned a farm and a tract number, and that's where that information is also documented. So that is one key part as an applicant. You must be the owner, operator, or other tenant in order to participate. Not only that, I've mentioned it earlier, the most important portion of it is you must have control of the land for the duration of the contract. What we don't want to do is enter into a contract or provide financial assistance to someone, and then you lose control. And by you losing control, it potentially prevents someone else from being able to take advantage of those dollars. Because once that contract is obligated in your name, and that particular fiscal year ends, those funds are then lost in the event that a contract is canceled. Land eligibility must be a part of an agricultural or NRPF operation as identified. And there we go again, under the effective control of the applicant, the land must be, you must be in control of the land for the duration. But one thing that's also important is it must be operated by the applicant with the equipment, labor management, and production or cultivation practices are substantially separate. That particular definition comes into play when we look at a situation whereas you have multiple people that are actually sharing equipment and farming together, but also applying for the same programs at the same time in different applications. In other words, what we're trying to avoid is providing compensation to multiple individuals on the same land doing the same exact thing. So that is a key component. That particular rule actually comes into play a lot when dealing with our conservation stewardship program. Now, with any of our programs, especially with Eqip, we have different categories in which a producer can qualify for. And as part of the benefit of these various different categories is they can have the opportunity to receive a higher cost share percentage. Well, as a general whole, in the state of North Carolina, we provide a 75-90% cost share. 75% cost share is for all general applications that do not meet the requirements of a historically underserved participant. Now, when we say historically underserved, that actually encompasses multiple groups, such as beginning farmer or rancher, socially disadvantaged, veteran farmer and rancher, and also limited resource. So as a historically underserved participant, you have the ability to receive up to 90% cost share. Now, how do I qualify as a beginning farmer? As a beginning farmer, you have to be farming for less than 10 consecutive years in order to qualify and receive the benefits of 90% cost share. As a veteran farmer, you must have served in the United States military, whether it be in the Army, Navy, Marine, Air Force, Coast Guard, and any of those actual branches. But also, you must also meet the requirements of have been farming for less than 10 consecutive years as well in order to qualify. A veteran farmer must also meet the requirements of a new and beginning farmer in order to obtain the veteran status and also receive the benefits of 90% cost share. Socially disadvantaged farmer or rancher. This is a group whose members have been subject to racial or ethnic prejudice because of their identity as members of a group without regard to individual qualities. Anyone that qualifies as a socially disadvantaged farmer has the ability to receive the higher cost share rate as well at 90%. Those groups that I just recently went over, the new and beginning farmer, socially disadvantaged, and veteran farmer are all considered and falls under the umbrella of historically underserved. So as you complete your application or any of your clients that complete an application to participate in NRCS program, be sure to check the box that does apply and actually so they can actually take advantage of the higher cost share rate and receive the benefits in which they so deserve. Now, when we talk about our various different programs and also the practices that actually can be available that to benefit our forested landowners, part of that actually is involved with making sure that these practices that are actually in place are those practices that literally address the resource concerns that have been identified as part of the planning process. But not only that, to ensure that we're actually following and actually accomplishing the ultimate objective of the landowner in reference to what they have identified as to what they're trying to achieve. As you can see on the screen, there are just a chosen few of the many practices that actually are available through our programs. In North Carolina, if I'm not mistaken, we have over 170 practices that are part of our cost list. And within that cost list, it also includes wildlife practices as well as forestry related practice. When we talk about forestry, we're talking about everything from tree and shrub establishment to the site preparation to plant trees, to fire break, wildlife planning, and even brush management, where we are able to go in and assist you in eradicating invasive species. So this is just a small portion of the various different practices that are available for forestry related applicants or landowners that actually are interested in any of our programs. As part of that, in doing so, in 2018, when the Farm Bill was released, there was some changes that were made that is beneficial to all producers, especially to our forestry producers, that I wanted to make sure I brought to everyone's attention. Under the Eqip program in the 2018 Farm Bill, there were some things that were actually identified. As you know, a lot of time participants actually have issues or probably financial situations that prevent them from being able to provide upfront money to get certain things taken care of. Well, NRCS has the ability to provide what we call an advance payment to participants to assist them in getting conservation practices implemented on their land, especially those that are part of their contract. Each participant that qualify for an advance payment can receive up to 50% of each of the contracted costs for each of the contract items that are in their contract. So that is a plus for all participants that actually meet the criteria. Only those that qualify as historical underserved have the ability to receive the advance payment, but that's where these funds are actually available to assist them in getting these practices implemented. Also, in an effort to try and be able to place additional funding in the arena for wildlife and also to go towards other forest-related means, the 2018 Farm Bill reduced the amount of percentages of state allocated funds from 60% to 50% to allow the additional percentage to go towards the benefit of forestry landowners. That benefit allowed us to increase our wildlife funding to 10% versus 5% in previous years. So this allows us to put more funding towards actual providing assistance to forested landowners that actually have an interest in developing wildlife habitat for our wildlife. Also, increased payment rates have been made available by certain practices such as that we call high priority practices. Those high priority practices now carry a weight of 90% cost share. There is a list of those high priority practices. Each of our local field officers are aware of those and can speak with you and provide that list at any point in time. Any of those practices that are listed on that high priority practice list can receive the 90% cost share no matter whether they meet historical underserved criteria or not. High priority practices are actually offered across the board. Moving forward, to speak a little bit more on our conservation stewardship program. As stated earlier, this particular program is designed to promote conservation and improvement of the natural resource concerns, but also to benefit all producers, regardless of size, by increasing their current level of management, also through the use of implementation of additional enhancements and actual practices. The stewardship program, it is a 5-year it requires a 5-year contract. As part of this particular program, you have the potential, participants have the potential of receiving up to $200,000 over the life of the 5-year contract. The minimum payment that a participant will receive if awarded a contract is $1,500 per year over a total of 5 years. So there'll be a total of $7,500 over a 5-year span. That particular cost can increase based on the number of resource concerns you're meeting, the enhancements that you have selected. Also, it includes the acres in which you're utilizing, as well as a payment for the land use in which you are addressing. So CSP is an opportunity for landowners to enhance what they currently have on the ground, but also to receive funding to install those enhancements as well as maintain. Participants have the ability to renew their contracts. After their original 5 years are up, the new Farm Bill allows them to renew their contracts for an additional 5 years. And one benefit that also is a part of this Farm Bill is that there's no limit to the number of renewals that you can actually have. One thing that is critical is that in order to renew, the same requirements that are required for stewardship, the general sign-up must be met also for renewal. You must be meeting specific resource concerns in order to meet the eligibility. As mentioned before, the Farm Bill for a CSP actually made some adjustments that allow producers to be able to potentially earn up to $200,000 over a 5-year span. One of the biggest changes that actually was a change from 2014 Farm Bill to 2018 is that in 2014, there was a maximum of $40,000 a year that could be paid for for that particular year, a part of that contract. Well, that has now been lifted, and there's no maximum payment that a participant can receive within 1 year, but the total contract cost itself is still maximized at $200,000. So if a participant gets a contract that's actually $200,000 and the enhancement that they install actually equates to $200,000 in the second year, then that participant can be paid that full amount, but they are still required to maintain the conditions of that contract and meet all of the expectations. Now, I mentioned a little bit about each of our different programs that we have available, and our most popular ones when you're looking at Eqip as well as CSP. Eqip has various different options of different programs that are available that participants can sign up for. And there's also, we encourage you, please take advantage of any and all programs that we have, for the simple fact is these funding that we receive here in the state of North Carolina are literally available to serve and provide to all participants. As a state, if we're unable to provide that funding to you all as landowners, then we'll have that reduction taken away from us based on our allocation from Congress in the next fiscal year. So we strive to make sure that every cent that we receive here in the state of North Carolina, that we're able to put it into the hands of our participants and also on the ground to improve conservation. Now, how do we go about signing up, and what is the process for signing up for Nrcs programs? First of all, any and all participants that meet the eligibility requirements can apply for Nrcs program. We often encourage you to please go into your local Nrcs office to apply. That gives you an opportunity to build a relationship with that person that's locally. Invite that person out to your farm and please sit down and visit with them and constantly ask them, hey, what kind of new programs do you got to have available? I can honestly say North Carolina is short-staffed, but we still try our best to make sure we provide the upper level of customer service that we possibly can. and we're not always able to meet each and every person that is out there. That's where we rely on a lot of our partners, such as our partners with the Sustainable Forestry Project, Centers for Heirs out of South Carolina, NC State, our North Carolina E&T extension agents, individuals of that sort. And this is statewide in every state and across the nation. We lean on our partners to also spread the word about the programs that we offer to benefit our landowners, especially in the forested arena. So anyone that is interested.
Julius, is a 5-minute warning.
Okay, thank you. They're encouraged to go into your local NRCS office to apply. And as they go into the office, as mentioned before, that local staff member will work with that participant to try and make sure that they actually identify the resource concerns that they have on their property and the programs that are available to benefit them in addressing those resource concerns. Also, the next step is they apply. They actually fill out an application. With that particular application being submitted for that particular program, anytime we take application, we rank each and every application in funding pools that are along with other like applications of the sort. And we rank cropland application with cropland, forestry application with forestry, and also wildlife with wildlife. Therefore, we don't get any of those. No one has an upper edge on the other. So we all rank all of them in like funding pools based on resource concerns and also land use. With the ranking, basically how we go about selecting application for funding is each application receives a ranking score. We look at that ranking score from the highest to the lowest within that ranking pool, and based on the amount of funding that we have available in that ranking pool. And we go down the list and we select those applications until we run out of funding. Once that takes place, we also then do what we call a pre-approval. We notify the participant that their application has been selected for funding and inquire if they want to proceed. And if they do, then we actually are able to then move forward with possibly development of a contract and then secure those funds for that participant to go ahead and begin implementing those practices. I do like to point out that any and all of our programs are very competitive. One thing that cannot be guaranteed, we cannot guarantee anyone a contract because it must go through that competitive process via the ranking score and also the availability of funds. So I just want to make sure everyone is aware that all of NRCS programs are competitive and we cannot guarantee a contract. Nonetheless, one thing we can guarantee is that if you don't submit an application, there's no way that you can be considered for funding. So we encourage you, please submit an application at any point in time. It can be withdrawn because it is not a binding document. So please, we encourage everyone to please submit an application. Just a couple of links that are part of my presentation that everyone can take advantage of. The North Carolina NRCS website that actually allows you to take a look at the various different programs that we have available, and also what is up and coming, and also talks about various different meetings and outreach that is available as well. Also, I always like to point out for yourself and for educational purposes, each individual has the ability to look at NRCS Web Soil Survey. Basically what that does is allow you to look at the soils that you have on your property that can help you to potentially do better management, planning, and planting when it comes to your crops and what you plan on doing on your property. And Dakota, that does it for me, and I hope everyone enjoyed it, and I'm ready to take questions if anyone has any.
Great, thank you so much, and thanks everybody. What I'm going to do is ask a couple of questions that came in. The first one is actually for Scott, and the question is, how can we influence state and federal policy leaders that keeping forests as forests is key to help manage climate change? It's a big question.
Yeah, I mean, that's the question, right? Frankly, well, as a forest landowner, I think what you can do, I personally think the best thing to do is to develop a personal relationship with the people that represent you in government and go in and talk to them and, explain to them your interest, your perspective as a forest landowner, and how you know, the ownership and management of your property is sequestering carbon, and the need for policy that allows forest landowners to benefit from the sequestration of carbon on their property. I think they can be, even the most ardent climate deniers, I think, can be swayed by personal entreaties and getting to know the people that represent you. And you can't always go to DC, but they come back to their districts, they come home. Going in to see them and having a conversation with them, talking to them about carbon sequestration programs and carbon markets is probably the best way to do it.
Great, thanks, Scott. Next question I do want to ask is for Josh. A landowner in Kentucky asks, well, there's a little background. So in my small town, we have a lot of issues with land sales and transfers. It becomes a real mess when numerous children have different goals and interests in the land, and forests often get sold and turned into business parks. I know that the center you work for is in South Carolina, but do you know if there are other similar services in other states like Kentucky?
I'm not sure if there's anyone in Kentucky providing direct on-the-ground legal resources. We're actually just now starting to engage some folks in Kentucky. If this individual would like to email me, I can see what I can find out for them and get back with them. That's not a problem at all. We do have some initial conversations with some folks on the ground in Kentucky, and maybe I could connect them with someone that might be able to assist them. Can I just give my email, or you want me to type it in I could type it in the chat?
Yeah, if you want to type it into the chat box, that would be great. And same
Sure.
with Scott and Julius as well, if that's something you are willing and able to do, because I know we're getting and closing to the end of the time here. Let's see if there's a question for Julius. Yeah, so a question came in saying, can I double dip for a CSP and Eqip using the conservation incentives contracts, or do I have to apply for the CIC and then choose only Eqip or CSP?
To whomever that was, great question. No, with this particular program, it's not considered double dipping. What we will do as Nrcs, we will ensure that we're not providing financial assistance to install the same practices or enhancements on the same land from multiple programs. So as part of CIC, it allows you to select both Eqip practices and receive your general Eqip rate, but also test CSP to see if it's a program you're interested in fully engaging in and possibly another sign up under CSP. So it's not necessarily double dipping when you're dealing with CIC, but it gives you an opportunity to test CSP to see if that's something you're interested in pursuing completely. Now, when you look at Eqip versus CSP general, as stated before, we will ensure that we're not actually contracting the same practices on the same land and also providing cost share at the same time. But you can actually receive an Eqip contract and a CSP contract at the same time.
Great, thanks, Julius.
Yes,
So
ma'am.
that does bring us just about to 3:30 Eastern time. Before everybody hops off, I do want to put into the chat box for those who are needing and wanting the SAF CE credits. There's a form that I just put into the chat box, so please fill that out with your information and I can get you all the right documents and all your information to SAF to get credit for today's webinar. But thanks again to all of our great speakers. It was a great, amazing lineup and a lot of really great information. And this webinar is being recorded, so it will be sent out and available for folks to watch afterwards, just in case there was something you missed. But thanks again, everybody. I hope you all have a great rest of your afternoons.
Thanks for inviting us.
Yes, bye.